Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Isolated Presidency by Jordan T. Cash, read by Joshua Saxon. Introduction. The baseline of presidential power. Since before the ratification of the Constitution, students, scholars, and statesmen in American politics have grappled with a fundamental question: how powerful is the President of the United States? As one might expect for such a vital and difficult issue, the answers have varied widely. Some have argued that presidential power relies largely on who the occupant of the Oval Office is, and that it is dependent on his personality, his political talents, or how he views himself and his office. These personalized conceptions of presidential authority leave the president, in Woodrow Wilson's memorable phrase, to be as big a man as he can. Outside the president's individual attributes, some have asserted that the president's capacity for action and ability to shape public policy is largely determined by his relationships with other institutional actors, such as Congress, his political party, and the public at large. For other scholars, presidential authority is variable depending on the context he is working in, such as his place in a particular cycle of political time. These are not, of course, the only approaches scholars have used to assess the extent of presidential power, nor are the different factors they examine the only ones to consider when evaluating how presidents shape policy. Indeed, given the variety of methods for studying the presidency along with the diverse situations that presidents have faced over nearly 2.5 centuries, it may be helpful to be more specific with our initial question. Instead of asking, how powerful is the presidency, we should ask, what authority is available to all presidents? In other words, what is the minimum power or the baseline of authority that all presidents may draw upon, regardless of their personal clout, political talent, institutional relationships, external events, and placement in political time? This question narrows our focus and has major implications for presidential power and American constitutionalism. For once we understand the minimum amount of power every president possesses, we can better comprehend how presidents use that basic authority in their interactions with other institutions as well as how they may seek to build upon it. To answer this new question, we must look to the core document that serves as the foundation for every presidency, the Constitution. I argue that the Constitution creates an empowering logic in the presidency through the office's structure, duties, and powers. This logic orients presidents' perspectives and provides them with significant discretion to pursue their constitutional, political, and policy goals as informed by that perspective. Examining how the Constitution influences presidential behavior and creates a strong baseline of authority for presidents independent of outside factors is critically important, given that much of the scholarship on the presidency underestimates how the Constitution forms the fundamental backdrop of presidential activity. Most famously, Richard Neustadt asserted that the president's formal constitutional powers were little more than a clerkship, with real authority being in the president's power to persuade. Even research that admits the presidency has formidable formal powers grounded in the Constitution often understates how extensive that constitutional authority is. For example, Terry Moe and William Howell readily recognize how the Constitution's structure affects presidential behavior and gives presidents certain advantages over their rivals in the other branches of government. Yet they contend that the presidency's primary influence in shaping policy comes not from the Constitution, but from unilateral powers that are influential precisely because they are not specified in the Constitution. In short, while the Constitution is important, it is not a sufficient source of power for presidents to be effective in policymaking. For the purposes of practical governance in the 21st century, Moe and Howell argue that the Constitution is a relic that undermines effective government, and must be changed in order to put the president at the helm and relegate Congress to the back seat where it belongs. Only with progressive reforms in the early 20th century, which in their view were only partially successful, did the United States gain a modern government centered around a powerful presidency. This view that the presidency initially created by the Constitution was not effective enough to handle the challenges of modern government is quite common in the literature on the office. Many scholars distinguish between a traditional presidency that existed in the 18th and 19th centuries grounded in the written Constitution, and a more robust modern presidency which emerged in the early to mid-20th century and has persisted into the 21st century. Proponents of this distinction often contend that presidents in the 19th century were not expected to be heavily involved in policy, and that Congress was the dominant force in government. In this vein, strong 19th century presidents like Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln are considered either as significant departures from the norm or as examples of a living constitution that enabled presidents who were creative in leveraging their sparse formal powers to set precedents culminating in a strong modern presidency. This idea is not, however, ubiquitous. A substantial and growing body of scholarship has argued that the Constitution gave the presidency considerable authority from the very beginning, and that the constitutional system cannot operate as intended without a powerful, energetic executive. Importantly, scholars in this tradition generally do not deny that the presidency has changed in certain ways, but see those changes largely as the maturation of an institution, grown from an original structure that contained the political equivalent of a genetic code for subsequent development. From this perspective, there is far more continuity between the traditional and modern presidencies than much of the modern presidency literature admits. This book follows this line of research, arguing for a certain degree of continuity between the traditional and modern presidencies. For while the office has changed over time, the constitutional logic that orients and empowers presidents has not. The Constitution remains the underlying foundation for all presidential administrations and provides the core authority that any president, regardless of his broader political context, may tap into to pursue his policy goals. Yet examining the presidency's constitutional logic at a theoretical level does not fully illustrate the Constitution's importance to the exercise of presidential power. We must also look to how presidents have used that power in practice. Past works arguing that the Constitution creates a strong presidency have typically focused on presidents who were able to successfully lead the people, their party, and the other branches such as Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln. While such examples illustrate the possibilities of presidential power and leadership, these presidents also possessed many personal and institutional advantages. Because of those advantages, their successes may be attributed to extra-constitutional sources, and they do not fully dispel the notion that a president's strength is dependent on personal or external factors. As a result, these examples obscure rather than clarify our view of the office's constitutional logic. This book cuts through these confounding factors by highlighting presidents who lacked these advantages. I argue that we gain the clearest view of the presidency's constitutional logic and the strength that results from it by observing those administrations where presidents were isolated from other branches of government, their own political parties, and the people, being left with nothing but their constitutional authority to rely on. For that purpose, I undertake case studies of what I refer to as the Isolated Presidents, John Tyler, Andrew Johnson, and Gerald Ford. Through a qualitative comparative analysis of all the presidents from George Washington to Donald Trump, which is included in the appendix, I found that these three presidents meet the three criteria that define presidential isolation. 1, they were unelected. 2, they faced divided government for the entirety of their tenure. And 3, they were affiliated with factious political parties. Under these conditions, Tyler, Johnson, and Ford are the most isolated presidents in American history. Their uniquely disadvantageous positions allow us to study their administrations as least likely cases for the exercise of presidential power. That is, if ever we were to expect presidents to be unable to exercise robust executive power, we would expect those presidents to be unelected, facing staunch opposition from Congress, and lacking a supportive party coalition. Beyond these isolating conditions, the difficulties these presidents faced become more apparent when we examine the context of their administrations. Tyler's mere assumption of the presidency after the death of William Henry Harrison in 1841 triggered a constitutional crisis, as the issue of whether the vice president actually becomes the president or merely serves as acting president was constitutionally vague. Even after he assumed the office, his legitimacy was still questioned, as some congressmen and even congressional resolutions insisted on referring to him as the acting president, or even as the ex-vice president. Aside from such indignities, the new executive had to contend with the legislative supremacist Whig Party, which had reached the zenith of its electoral success and political power. When Tyler began exercising his constitutional powers, most notably the veto, the Whigs, who had elevated him to the vice presidency in the first place and were meant to serve as his supporting coalition, expelled him from the party. When Tyler tried to enlist the Democratic Party to support him, he was rebuffed, as the Democrats did not trust the president due to his having left their party several years earlier. The Whigs' expulsion and the Democrats' rejection left Tyler as the president without a party, at odds with the robust partisan establishments of both parties. Johnson, a Southern Democrat, ran with Abraham Lincoln as part of the National Union Party against the Democratic ticket in 1864. Becoming president after Lincoln's shocking assassination, he was tasked with handling the reconstruction of the South and restoring the Union after the bloodiest war and greatest constitutional crisis in American history. Yet Johnson quickly became estranged from the politically dominant Republicans in Congress and in his own cabinet. The tension between Johnson and Congress was exacerbated by the Republicans' desire to make Congress the center of national policymaking and substantially limit presidential power, provoking a philosophical clash with the more executive-focused Johnson. The conflict between the two branches degenerated to the point that Johnson became the first president to be impeached, escaping removal by only a single vote in the Senate trial. Moreover, Johnson had the disadvantage of being a Southerner following the Civil War, adding a geographical element to his isolation as his Reconstruction policies were unpopular in the militarily victorious and politically powerful North. The extent of Tyler and Johnson's isolation becomes particularly acute when we consider that they operated in the era of courts and parties. As historical scholarship notes, these institutions provided a substantial amount of procedural and administrative order during the 19th century. The lack of party support and the inability to have judicial nominees confirmed, as we shall discuss in chapters 2 and 3, deprived these presidents of the regular administrative infrastructure that other presidents depended on before and after the Civil War. Finally, Ford was in the unique situation of not even having been elected vice president. Instead, he was appointed to the position by Richard Nixon and confirmed by Congress in 1973 under the terms of the recently ratified 25th Amendment. Thus, when Ford was subsequently elevated to the presidency after Nixon resigned in disgrace, he had roughly the same electoral legitimacy as a cabinet member or a Supreme Court justice, which is none at all. Yet this was only the beginning of Ford's institutional problems. Soon after taking office, the Republicans sustained large losses in the 1974 midterms, giving Democrats a veto-proof House majority and a Senate supermajority. In addition to this partisan opposition, Watergate and the excesses of the imperial presidency under Nixon and Lyndon Johnson had made Congress eager to assert itself and bring the White House to heel. With the office already diminished by scandal, Ford was left facing a hostile Congress that possessed the institutional and political will to try to severely restrict presidential power, leading some scholars to consider Ford's administration as the beginning of the imperiled presidency. Making matters worse was the fact that Ford also had to contend with severe divisions in the Republican Party, with some conservative Republicans speaking openly about abandoning the GOP to form a new conservative party. While this split did not occur, conservative dissatisfaction with moderate Republicans like Ford led to intra-party opposition to many of the president's policy measures. The division culminated in Ronald Reagan's surprisingly popular primary challenge in 1976, which went all the way to the convention and nearly unseated the incumbent. As a result, Ford was forced not only to face strong Democratic majorities in Congress that were eager to block his policy proposals and constrain executive power, but also a large rebellious faction of his own co-partisans. All of this was on top of institutional changes that had strained the relationship between the president, the parties, and the administration, effectively leaving the office in complete political isolation. In overviewing Tyler, Johnson, and Ford, we see that they faced each of the three isolating conditions to the worst degrees possible. All three were unelected and had no national base of support. All three confronted divided government, with their opposition possessing large majorities in both houses of Congress. And all three encountered serious resistance from large contingents of what were meant to be their supporting party coalitions. Their isolation becomes even more evident when we consider their position in political and secular time. In Stephen Skoranik's breakdown of political time, each of these presidents was preemptive, resisting the forms of the dominant regime in which they governed. In secular time, they likewise served in the White House when the presidency and even the Constitution itself were under enormous stress. Tyler's succession, Reconstruction, and Watergate were all constitutional crises that had to be resolved for the country to move forward. Similarly, The office was at a crisis point during these administrations as opposing Congresses aggressively sought to confine executive power to the point of unbalancing the constitutional system altogether. It is not, therefore, simply that these presidents were in bad institutional positions, but the presidency itself was at a historical nadir in all three cases. Yet despite these crises and their own inability to bring the People Congress and their intra-party opponents to their side, the isolated presidents were still able to fight back, preserving their office and achieving their policy goals using the only source of authority they had left, the Constitution. By evaluating the isolated presidents, we will gain two crucial insights into constitutional presidential authority. First, we shall discover that the Constitution provides even the most isolated presidents with substantial power and agency. The structure, duties, and powers of the office come together into a cohesive and practical internal logic, forming a unique institutional perspective and providing a baseline of authority that all presidents can draw upon. Additionally, we will learn that the powers the Constitution grants to presidents are often enough to overcome substantial opposition and successfully achieve their policy goals. Second, where the Constitution is ambiguous, or where there are tensions within the office's underlying logic, the isolated presidents illustrate how presidents stripped of external supports interpret their authority and resolve those tensions. They often interpret and utilize their authority in similar ways, illuminating what a common presidential construction of the Constitution looks like and which pathologies within the constitutional logic presidents are most likely to embrace. Observing this common construction will also enable us to perceive how presidents themselves contribute to the ideational development of the office, cultivating and defending a particular conception of constitutional executive power and setting precedents that may be adopted by their successors. In making this argument, I do not discount the fact that institutions evolve over time, and that the presidency underwent major changes in the 20th century to become the modern presidency. Rather, I argue that by examining presidents from before and after the development of the modern presidency, we can better appreciate how the basic constitutional authority available to all presidents is consistent over time. So even while many things changed in the century between Johnson and Ford, both of them, as well as Tyler, still had access to the same inherent constitutional authority with which to pursue their agendas, and the basic constitutional structures, duties, and powers of the presidency remained largely unchanged. By demonstrating how the isolated presidents used their constitutional powers before and after the inauguration of the modern presidency, it becomes apparent that policy successes achieved by presidents acting alone are not predicated on the modern presidency's development, but can be traced to the office's constitutional authority. Understanding the constancy of the presidency's innate logic also aids us in comprehending the office's temporal development. For with a clear view of the nuances and contours of the office's constitutional logic, we are better able to assess whether institutional changes within the presidency are in line with its underlying logic. Those that are inconsistent with it, or that create new tensions within the presidency, may then be considered as constitutional disharmonies. Such clarity is particularly useful when considering the modern presidency, as it helps us determine which aspects of the modern presidency are compatible with the Constitution, and which are layered on and potentially at odds with the fundamental constitutional framework. Studying the isolated presidents will therefore not only help us better comprehend their individual presidencies, but also allow us to generalize and improve our understanding of the presidency itself. As the presidency is part of a complex constitutional system, analyzing the office through the distinctive lens of the isolated presidents has the added potential of providing further insights into how other institutions interact with the presidency, enhancing our comprehension of the American system as a whole. By understanding the core constitutional authority that the isolated presidents relied on even when the office was under heavy attack from the other branches, we gain a better sense of the basic powers and responsibilities of the office and how they may be utilized to advance a president's goals. Additionally, we discover which fundamental powers and duties are the most resilient and resistant to infringement by other institutions, giving us a clearer view of how the other branches may be going beyond their constitutional purview when they try to exercise certain core powers and functions themselves. Beyond simply providing a baseline of presidential power that can be generalized and applied to other circumstances, assessing the isolated presidents has particular resonance in the current political climate. In the 50 years between 1973 and 2023, 35 saw divided control of government at the national level, making the question of what a president can do on his own more significant. Modern presidents in divided government have often complained of many of the same problems that the isolated presidents did. For example, Tyler's complaint in 1842 about Congress seeking to derail his administration remains a persistent grievance of presidents in the modern era, perhaps most famously with Harry Truman's description of the do-nothing 80th Congress in 1948, a description repeated by Barack Obama in 2014 and Donald Trump in 2019. The isolated presidents provide lessons and examples of what constitutionally derived actions a president can take when confronted with the recurring issues of divided government and political gridlock. Moreover, as the presidency trends toward a plebiscitary model where parties have less control over the chief executive, the lack of strong party support for isolated presidents offers an enlightening reference point for presidents forced to act outside the normal party system. Understanding the isolated presidents and their lack of support or attachment to parties helps us perceive if presidents without parties are liberated to be more individually active and exercise more flexibility as entrepreneurial political leaders, or if party support and attachment are necessary for presidents to successfully govern. Yet if we are to understand how the isolated presidents exhibit the strength of the constitutional presidency and its underlying logic, we must first understand what that underlying logic is. Chapter 1 lays out the presidency's constitutional logic as it was understood by the men who drafted, ratified, and operationalized the Constitution. To that extent, this logic could be called a federalist view of the presidency. I do, however, point out areas where there are serious alternative conceptions of presidential authority as well as where the logic has internal tensions, diverging pathologies, or leaves questions of presidential authority to be determined by political contestation. Recognizing what the presidency's constitutional logic is provides a foundation for the later chapters, as we will be able to see how the Constitution shapes and influences the isolated president's behavior, while simultaneously imbuing them with agency and a capacity for action. Similarly, in knowing what the alternative understandings and tensions within the logic are, we will have a clearer view of how the isolated presidents interpret their own powers and seek to resolve those constitutional ambiguities. To clearly lay out its constitutional logic in Chapter 1, I first demonstrate how the Constitution requires a strong executive. I then show how the structural features of the executive are given form through the office's enumerated duties and powers. To help connect these various facets of the constitutional presidency, I adopt Clinton Rossiter's language of presidential roles, specifically those of chief executive, chief legislator, chief diplomat, and commander-in-chief. I also add the new role of chief constitutionalist, which provides a vantage point from which to assess the president's capacity for constitutional interpretation and how the constitutionally required presidential oath plays into the use of presidential power. Through these 5 roles, we will learn how the presidency's duties and powers emerge and interact with the structural attributes of the office, orienting the office holder and creating a space for presidential agency in pursuing his objectives. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 are the case studies of Tyler, Johnson, and Ford, respectively. Each case study follows the same basic pattern. First, I conduct a brief assessment of the state of the presidency when the isolated president took office. Doing so provides us with the basic historical context and the relative strength of the different institutions at the time of the isolated president's administration. This becomes particularly important with Ford, as there I will discuss how the developments of the modern presidency altered the office's relationship with other institutions and expanded its scope for action. Next, I observe that individuals' pre-presidential thoughts on executive power as a kind of control, as we can see whether that president was already supportive of strong executive actions before entering office. If he was a strong supporter of executive power, it would indicate that he was predisposed to use presidential power aggressively. If he was not a strong supporter of executive power and after becoming president began using his authority expansively, it suggests that the constitutional structure of the office altered his conception of the presidency and his interpretation of the extent of his new powers. From there, I give an account of the individual's presidency with separate sections on domestic and foreign policy. In both areas, I assess how the presidents succeeded in realizing their objectives when relying solely on their constitutional authority and in the face of strong institutional opposition. In evaluating success, I measure it on 2 levels. 1, the constitutional level, whether they were able to use their powers despite significant opposition, and 2, the policy level, whether they achieved their stated policy objectives. Each case study ends with an analysis section where I use the framework of presidential roles to elucidate how each president displays the office's constitutional logic. The analysis of each administration give us the opportunity to see how the presidents reflected upon their formal powers, how they were oriented by and acted in line with the presumption of the office's constitutional logic, how they dealt with constitutional ambiguities and logical tensions, and how their views of executive power evolved during their terms while interacting with other institutional actors. Notwithstanding their divergent backgrounds, differing agendas, and diverse historical contexts, the isolated presidents utilized their powers and interpreted the ambiguities within the constitutional logic in remarkably similar ways, indicating that certain institutional pathologies and inducements influence presidential behavior more than others. My conclusion ends the book by reviewing the case studies and deriving general lessons about the presidency and its constitutional logic from them. I also discuss the contemporary relevance of these lessons, noting that even as the presidency appears to become unmoored from other institutions and American politics becomes institutionally thick, the Constitution remains an empowering force at the core of the office. While it can be difficult to find something new to say about the presidency, we can learn something new about the office by examining three of its most obscure occupants. John Tyler, Andrew Johnson, and Gerald Ford each gave us a clear view of the presidency's constitutional logic and demonstrate how powerful the office is when deprived of assistance from Congress, the parties, and even the public. Given that presidents in recent years are often confronted with similar difficulties, we must look to the isolated presidents as more than mere historical curiosities. Rather, we should see them as examples who can provide unique, if unexpected, glimpses into the nature of constitutional presidential authority and how the Constitution empowers all presidents to pursue their agendas. 1. The constitutional logic of the presidency. The constitutional logic of the presidency emerges from the relationship between the structure, duties, and powers of the office. The structure influences the president's behavior by orienting him to see issues from a particular perspective and to possess characteristics inclining him to act in ways the other branches are not suited to. The perspective and traits derived from this structure are then given expression through the office's constitutionally enumerated duties and powers. The duties require the president to undertake actions that are consistent with his structural attributes and utilize his unique perspective in the construction of policy. Similarly, the powers allow the president to act in accordance with his institutional inclinations and provide the means by which he can achieve the ends set by his constitutional duties. By examining and laying out the various facets of the presidency's constitutional logic, particularly as it was understood by the statesmen who drafted, ratified, and implemented the Constitution, we will be able to see what function the presidency was designed to serve in the broader constitutional system, and how its structure, duties, and powers operate together to fulfill that function. Establishing this foundation will enable us to observe in the succeeding chapters how closely the actions of the isolated presidents adhere to this logic, demonstrating its continued influence in empowering presidents and shaping their behavior. Furthermore, as this chapter notes, those areas where there are ambiguities or tensions within the office's constitutional logic, we will be able to see how the isolated presidents resolve these ambiguities in similar ways, independently embracing a common understanding of their constitutional authority. To comprehensively overview the presidency's constitutional logic, this chapter proceeds as follows. I first discuss how the regime created by the Constitution requires a strong executive. From there, I examine the structure of the presidency and how it fosters certain institutional attributes that enable the executive to fulfill its distinctive function within the constitutional system. I then use the framework of presidential roles to demonstrate how the office's structure interacts with its duties and powers, as well as with the other branches. As aforementioned, I also note alternative interpretations and ambiguities within the constitutional logic when they arise. The constitutional need for a strong executive. To understand the constitutional logic of the presidency, we must first ask what sort of executive the regime created by the Constitution requires, which in turn compels us to define what kind of regime the Constitution creates. James Madison remarked in Federalist 14 that in writing the Constitution, Americans had discovered the basis of unmixed and extensive republics. This large republic is not, however, a unitary government, but a compound republic, partaking of both a national and federal character with power divided between the states and the national government. In its operation, the new national government directly operates on individuals rather than on the states.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?